lot of history up in this part. Some of it probably best not spoke about. I think last time we got as far up as Garner's Tunnel, if I remember. Yeah. And then we ended back at Minford, me saying, if I remember right, and this was my office. Yes. And that must have been 1977, I think, right, when I moved into it. But I'd have rather jumped a lot of things, and in a sense, from where we got to at Garner's Tunnel, and we were looking at the railway had opened to Leath in 1968. And then we had to set about the rather hastily laid track to Leath, of consolidating it. It was many years ago when we discovered that Ffestiniog Railway didn't have much geometry in it because of the way it had been relayed in the early days. You know, the track was just put back, well, pretty well equidistant between the walls, which made it not far from correct. You couldn't go anywhere else, really. You know, 6'10" train in a 7-foot cut-in, you haven't got a lot of option, have you? No. But when we first started on trying to apply some geometry because of trying to get good ride quality from the twist-intolerant carriages, so the track quality had to be raised considerably. And they started off with the Hallard schemes with guys from King's Cross, from the Permanent Way office in King's Cross, and they'd come up here for a weekend as volunteers, take it all away, and then send me these wonderful schemes. But they worked on at the time on the East Coast main line, rebuilding it for the Delta gauge, and they were upping things from 70 mile an hour to 100 mile an hour by moving a river. And one of the schemes they sent me for Tyler's cutting to get it up from the 5 mile an hour that it was then up to 20 only meant carving 3 feet off the side of the cutting. And I said, I'm not going to do that, and they were a bit puzzled. But it was good fun, playing with strings. Playing with strings? Technical, and over many years I think we got pretty good at it, and we managed to get the Ffestiniog geometrically, I think, as good as its environments will allow it. It's a struggle to keep it there. And before we'd relayed any of the track up here, bear in mind it was all still here, but it was pretty decrepit, and every time we wanted to move a train up here for any reason, we'd have to go along and put a few keys in, sleeper here and there, make sure the train wasn't going to fall off. The first time, thinking about it, the first time we came up here with a steam engine, well, certainly Blanche anyway, the little water tank down there, just by it somewhere, there was a stay wire from one of the telephone poles up onto the rock there to stop it falling over, and it ripped its whistle off because nobody had thought to check anything. We didn't do that sort of thing then. You know, it went along in 1946, so it should go along again, shouldn't it? It'd be fine. So as part of setting things up for the deviationists to build a line, which we'll come to later, all the history of it and everything, they had a mess room down here. So we had to come up here and build a new turnout here and put in a siding for them, and also for Colonel Campbell, who lived in the big house down there, who was, I believe he was a county council solicitor at Dolgethley, and he got 2 little simplex engines, and he had this siding here, and he got some sort of running powers to go to Tannabulk, so that he could drive down to Tannabulk, then take his boiler suit off, and underneath was his suit, and he'd get in his posh car, go off to work, and then come back and reverse the process and come back up here. So we came up here, we built a turnout and laid a siding, and that preceded most of the track relaying up here. And then ultimately it all got relayed with a bullhead rail, because you see it's all flat bottom now, so that's another step in the eternal evolution of the thing. So the deviation, in a nutshell, although probably everybody will have some idea of it, they built a power station up at Tannagrisha, a hydroelectric pump storage one, and the bottom lake, the big lake, it flooded the old railway where it came out the tunnel at the far end. And you can still see the old track bed to this, travel on the train. And recently they exposed the far end portal, because it's got a big plug in it.
Ah, okay.
Otherwise there wouldn't be a lake there.
Yes.
And they have to examine it because it comes under the reservoir or the dam's regulations.
Oh, okay.
That's an amusing little thing. Some years ago, a couple of them got in touch with me and they said, we need to go into the tunnel to examine the plug.
Right.
How do we get there? And he says, can we walk in from this end? And again, tied up with a deviationist, that one of their site buildings they'd put near the tunnel, and they built a dam inside the tunnel. Bear in mind the whole railway was on a gradient.
Yeah.
So the tunnel was like that, so they built a big dam about 8 feet high, so that caught an awful lot of water way back into the tunnel. Water for all their services, for the mess room they built. So the guy says, can we walk in there? And I said, well, no, you'll need a boat.
Yeah.
But also the shafts on the top, stuff had been constantly falling down, so there was great heaps of stuff inside, so they never got in that way.
No.
How they didn't know that, I don't know. So eventually they uncovered the far end of it and exposed the whole portal, and presumably every now and then they have to examine it again.
Yeah.
So it should keep the thing clear. Yeah, so the line had got flooded by this pump storage thing, and because they thought it would never reopen, because they thought all these rich Englishmen playing with trains, it'll never get this far.
Yeah.
But over the years, there was a lot of pressure to rebuild the line, and so the deviation became just that, to deviate the line to avoid the lake,
bypass the lake.
Which actually meant 2.5 miles of new line with a spiral, which I believe is the only one in Britain, and a new tunnel.
Right. Okay.
And this was, initially it was all done as a volunteer thing.
Right, okay.
I think it was 1965 they first started.
Yeah.
And they used to turn up in the dead of night on a Friday at Tannaborg, and a guy from the local co-op had dumped a load of provisions for the weekend down there, and they put them on trolleys and pushed them up the line from Tannaborg to the Ath. This was before we were relaying this bit, because that caused them a bit of problems when we were relaying it, because they couldn't do that, you know. And then they'd work on pick and shovel, basically, digging the cut-ins and building embankments on this new line that the railway company, I think, thought they were all balmy and it would never happen, it would take too long, and it didn't really seem in those days, although its intention that it expressed was to rebuild the railway to Blaenau.
Yeah.
But running to Tannaborg and then to the Ath seemed a nicely contained little thing. And I think there wasn't an awful lot of obvious desire of the company to build a thing. So I think they felt they were rather on their own, and they probably didn't even think they were building a railway. It was just, they used to advertise it as come to Wales for a dirty weekend.
Right, okay.
In more ways than one. And so to service this construction of the thing by these volunteers, they had to have somewhere to stay.
Yeah.
And initially, Colonel Campbell, who lived down here in this massive place, and the end building, I think they called the barn in those days, that became the deviationist mess.
Oh, right, okay.
And what with the siding here and the Colonel having his little engine, and he even had a cableway with a winch built into here that went down to there. It's quite an amazing place up here. And so whilst we ran the trains and rebuilt the railway up to here, they beavered away up in like the middle of nowhere at the start of building 2.5 miles of railway. It's called various things, but I think most people know it as Bunny's Crossing. Bunny was one of the big names and the big people this way as well.
Yes.
You know. He came here fairly early in the deviation thing. He worked with us on the track quite a bit as a volunteer, but he became Mr. Deviation, really.
Mr. Deviation.
It got to a point where, to facilitate the volunteers coming at weekends, a certain organisation had to be done. They were getting on things like compressors and bits of machinery. Things had to be set up for the weekend. So Bunny became employed as a deviation supervisor, or whatever you like to call it. He was a big man, big black beard. He'd been a Marine down at Poole, I think it was. He had a big loud voice.
Yeah, certainly paints a picture.
And he used to call most people youth. Hey youth, what are you doing, youth? He's a big-hearted man as well, but he was terrifying until you got to know him, because he'd come right up close to you with his beard in your face, and it was usually, I want.
Yeah.
I want this, that and the other, I want it now. You know, when you got to know him, he's a smashing guy, real nice guy. Jumping back a little bit then to the consolidating of the Tannaburg to the earth. It was obviously had to be done before we started moving on towards ultimately Ffestiniog Railway. As you can see here again, flat bottom rail. The whole thing was initially, it was laid actually with rail bullhead that came from the Penryn quarry.
Right, okay, yeah.
At Bethesda. In 24-foot lengths. It was, I think the whole story of Ffestiniog could have been rather different if we hadn't, in about 1962 or 3, we bought 6 miles of rail and 2 engines from the Linda and Blanche, which at one time were doing about 12,000 miles a year each. And with this rail as well, you know, if we hadn't had that for a pretty knockdown sum,
probably won't be here.
then the history of this thing would be somewhat different.
Yes.
And what happened to all this bullhead rail as we relayed it with the heavier rail, and this particular lot, and a hell of a lot of it, probably a third of the railway now, is with this particular type of rail that weighs 75 pounds to every yard, which is a bit heavy, but it's all second hand. And it was about the only stuff of good enough quality at a price we could afford. And a lighter rail would have been laid in quarries, mines and whatnot, heavily used, covered in concrete maybe, in short lengths, very sharp bends, worn out. So we got loads and loads of this, and it displaced the bullhead rail that we relayed it in 1968. That got cascaded to other bits of the railway and replaced worn out 1869 or whatever it was, double head rail that was worn down to perhaps not much more than £30 a yard. Well, here's your first sight of the deviation. Like I was saying before, we had to build a spiral to gain height. There was all sorts of schemes for this. Effectively, the railway was underneath a lake, and there was a big hill in the way as well. And there's all sorts of schemes that had ridiculous gradients and going round miles out here, a tunnel there, and inclines here and there. The scheme that eventually happened was, as you see in front of you there, if you imagine the old route went pretty well straight on up to the tunnel, and at the other end of that tunnel you come out under the water. And so at the top of the station here, it turned right and turned through 360 degrees and gained, I think it's about 26 feet, something of that nature, in about half a mile. And the flyover. I mean, that in itself was interesting, although I was never involved with the construction of the deviation, the earthworks side of it, although I had no responsibility or anything with it until we came to the track laying. But whenever anything interesting was happening, we'd all come trooping up here. And when this thing was been built, they used some quite novel ways of getting the beams up there by using a little diesel engine and cables and pulleys and hoisting them up and sort of sliding them out. And the pillars, it looked like giant toilet rolls, which they filled with concrete.
As you do.
It was kind of spiral type, looked like cardboard, you know, made out of cornflakes or something. And they must have been a bit more beefy than that. But we did get involved when they were preparing the site, they had to cut back into the rock to put the pillars, and they proposed that they would blast it all.
Right.
We were involved because the old track was still here, and we had to take it away afterwards.
Yeah.
So we had a load of skips, V-shaped skips,
Yeah.
contractors skips from quarries, you know. And we thought, if we put them all in the cutting and then blast it, it'll fill them all.
Did it work?
Yeah, it filled them.
It filled them.
And of course there was stuff all over the place. And we made a great mistake of pushing them out a bit further out and leaving them there full. Now, bearing in mind that this spiral, this new railway, was been built across the land of a guy called Aneurin Davies,
Right.
who became known as Davies the Very Bad.
Right.
Because there was another Davies further down who was just Davies the Bad.
Right.
And over the years, they, in my opinion, they swapped, and he became the bad, and he became the very bad.
Right.
And eventually, Aneurin, I eventually got on very well with him, and even went for tea in his house a couple of times.
Yeah.
But that was probably 30 years later. And he didn't like the railway, and he probably didn't like the English who were coming here and telling him, we're going to build a railway across your land. Understandably.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And so he saw it a fair game to be disruptive.
Right.
And so the next day when we came up here, the 4 or 5 skips that we'd laboriously put everything off the ground and loaded them on, there was 4 or 5 big heaps at the side of the line, because him and probably one of his guys had come up and just tipped them. And lots of little things like that. And I'm sure in his mind there was annoyance, but there was also a bit of fun. And many, many years later, when finally the thing actually opened through to Blaenau in 1982, wasn't it? And we had the big opening day and the train with loads of people invited, all the important people and everything, and me as well. And we kind of were given a carriage each as host. And in my carriage was Aneurin Davies. And he turned up with his best tweed jacket with the patches on the sleeves, his good farmer's going out hat, all that sort of thing, you know. And we were sitting opposite across one of the little tables, and we were talking about the early days and the deviationists and the fun he'd had rounding them up with his dogs when they knocked his wall down and all that sort of thing. And there's 2 people, I don't know who the hell they were, sitting there listening intently. And then one of them said to him, "Excuse me," he says, "are you anything to do with the railway?" And he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye. And he said, "Oh yes." He said, "We've had some good battles." And I thought, wow, that's it, we've cracked it. Finally, he's just Mr. Davies. Not bad or very bad or anything, you know? It's quite a moment. Right, here we are on the Rosslyn high level. Good place to see the extent of the deviation, the curves that it goes around and the height that it gains, particularly at the far end there. When you can look up to the railway, you get the real indication of height because it's fairly close to you. You can, if you imagine the old line going straight on up there, and for a long time we kept a siding there while all the construction and the relaying and everything. And this was many days when we were actually starting to lay the permanent track around here. Was a scene of great shunting in the dark at the end of the day, in the rain usually.
So now you've just got the sidings here.
So you can see the things comes around here, very sharp curves, 200-foot radius all the way around across here. Squeals its way around the back there on the curves there, and then it carries on above the old routes, which we'll see a bit of later in the day when we'll go further up. You can see the remains of the old line that was abandoned when this one was opened. The reason, so the history says, we're here at all is because when the thing closed down in 1946, it couldn't be abandoned because there was no clause in the original act for abandonment. So that had to come through the light railway order for building part of this and include a clause or whatever to allow abandonment of the then disused section from here up to the old tunnel. For many years, this was actually a passing loop. Well, it was a terminus from 1968 until gradually, as the deviation continued, and we started laying permanent track on it, because it had temporary construction type track to start with, and then they built a shuttle train, a little diesel and a carriage with a driver point in the end, and that would go from like a bay platform at the far end when the main train came in, as far as it could, and that sort of went in stages up almost a tunnel south. And as well as the bay, there was the loop, the engine run round, and then when the full service started going beyond here, the place got signalled and it became a full token station. When it was a sort of fully fledged crossing place, then one of the features of the railway that people got quite excited about was you could actually have a train coming underneath here and another one over the top. Or one coming up, there's one be coming down. And if the timing got right, then it was quite spectacular. Well, we've lost that now because it's not a token station anymore. It's part of the section from Tannabalk through to Tanagrisha. And if a train came underneath here and it saw one coming over the top of here now, somebody might get a little bit worried.
It'd be a little bit worrying.
Being a single line, Because we used to come up here, if we were working anywhere up near here in the summer, when the DVs, when it was still the pick and shovel type approach in all the cuttings all around here.
Still
and like I said some time ago, they advertised it's come here for a dirty weekend. And we used to go up the hills and look down into the cutting, and they were all there with picks and shovels, and on a hot day, there was all these girls in their underwear. And you know, half the railway would be coming up here. And all, Okay, well, where we've got to now is top end of the Ath station, which I think to a lot of people on the railway, once the train started running to the Ath, this was where they perceived the deviation started from. If you can imagine, without the track and the embankment here, this was just considerably lower, about the same level as the lake over there, roughly. And the old railway was by then on a fairly narrow embankment, continuing up there through the trees up towards the old tunnel. And so they started by quarrying behind the trees there, and again with a little contractor's track, wheeling the skips out and tipping, and there's cutting just over the other side where they're doing the same. So, and after about a year it became visual that there was these two embankments getting closer and closer, right? But because this was just a bog of undeterminable depth, and they're thinking, well, if we just tip stuff into it, whether it'll sink, whether it'll float on the top or whatever. So who decided this? I don't know, it might have been Gerald Fox, the engineer or whatever, to blast the bog. Now Colonel Campbell who lived down in the big house where we come from, he had a shop firing licence.
Right.
And somehow, how they did it, I don't know, but they drilled or made holes into the bog or driven explosive down through the swamp or whatever to blast it and loosen it so that as they tipped, it would go right down into it rather than sink over the next 20 years, as I understand it. Now, this was quite widely publicised around the railway that this bog blast was going to happen.
Okay.
And I remember quite a lot of us standing over near that bush there because the embankment just dropped straight down into the bog here. There's old Colonel, he was a big, big man, right? And he had braces to hold his trousers up. And he was in the middle of the bog, he lit the fuses, and he started to kind of run through the bog, and his braces broke, and his trousers were falling down, and he was staggering through the swamp, holding his trousers up, and the fuse was burning, and we were all standing up there laughing. Anyway, he got out of the way, and all of a sudden there was this great kind of dull boom, and then a sort of couple of milliseconds later the place erupted, and it went whomp, and it just went up like that, and then it started going like that. And we were standing over there,
Like a big
and we were thinking,
display.
oh, that's good, isn't it? Oh, look, it's coming this way, run. So we set off running down, but we weren't quick enough. And the sky went black, and stinking rain came down on us. The deviationists seem to get to like explosives, and they like big bangs. And from my observation, they used to drill the holes all the way along the ledge round the back there, because it's on the mountain. They had to make a ledge into it, so they used to drill loads of holes and fill them with lots of explosive. And now dear old Colonel would come wandering up here and light the fuse. And whether he knew how deep the holes were, how much they put in or what, I don't know. But they'd move a bit of mountain from there over there. And the Roslin house there, certainly once, maybe twice, when they were widening the cut down here to get the loop in, they blew stuff through its roof.
Ooh.
As they like big bangs.
But that didn't go down well.
No. Well, it did come down very well, straight through the roof. When this became a passing loop and the train service continued up there, the top end loop points were just about here. Yeah. And if you imagine, you see the sharpness of the curve, well, it turned out on the inside of it, it was horrendously sharp. Yeah. And these sidings, this loop now, most of that track was at that time part of the loop.
Right, okay.
Now, the place was signalled. There was a signal box back in the V between this line and where the old line went. And the home signal was here, just what we're standing on. And there's the bottom of the post. Yeah. And it was a massive thing. If you look in books and magazines, you see this picture of this huge thing with, I think it had two arms on it, mighty thing. And because of the nature of this area, a freshly tipped embankment across a swamp,
used to lean.
Well, to stop it leaning and disappearing down here, this concrete goes underneath the track.
Oh, right, okay.
So somewhere over among the rubble there, so a massive kind of cantilever type thing.
Right, okay.
So if the signal ever tried to fall over it, take the track with it. There's just down there somewhere, there's a little adit going in.
Right.
There might be more of them, probably. I mean, there's very little stuff come from it. Yeah. So it must have been a little trial thing, perhaps looking for lead or copper or something. This great and glorious stone was put up here. G.D. Fox, the engineer, Gerald D. Fox, who went to, was it San Francisco I think he went to build a subway or something or other, and he's been working on this sort of thing all over the world. And amazing guy. And for many years, this thing had fallen over because probably the ground was a bit soft, you know. Yeah. And we were working around here on track maintenance one time, and we wondered what it was, so we stood it up.
And there it is.
And so all its glory, there it is. We had the whole weekend with those two. The chimps driving them down.
Very good with this.
Well, it's a good spot to illustrate what the deviation's all about.
Yeah.
And start to wonder why it was done.
Yeah.
Because if you look down that way,
Yeah.
a bit further back, you can see the original line down below here on a big stone embankment that led into a tunnel just over there. And that tunnel went right through this hill, something like half a mile long. And it was the original route, and it came out in what's now a flooded valley. So most of the time it's underwater, because it's a pump storage power station. So sometimes the bottom lake gets pumped way up to the top, and if there's not a lot coming in, it exposes a lot of the bottom of the valley, and including the tunnel mouth at the other end. So having gone round the spiral back there, it follows the old line to about here, and then there's, I think it's 268 metres is a figure that rings in my head for the new tunnel up here. Then it follows the old line again round the back of the power station, and then comes back downhill to meet the original route. So never again could you run a gravity train from Blaina down to Portmannock. So that's one bit of the history of this thing. Or the slate train was the reason for it being built, but so the power station has really robbed the thing of its essential reason for being here. So now we run tourists instead. This tunnel I likened to a black hole because it sucked everything into it over quite a lot of years. But it was sucking in people and things and money. And I suppose over all the years I've been here, the tunnel was perhaps the one bit I wouldn't say I enjoyed. In fact, probably whatever the opposite of enjoy is, that's what I did. It was a key part, obviously, to this, because there's no way you could get through there without a tunnel. A lot of people say, why didn't you just make it a cut-in? And then if you look up here and you can see it, and the depth of cut-in would have to have been huge. Quite apart from the fact of whose land it was and all these sort of things. There was a scheme, an earlier scheme from about where we are, to go round in a great big circle here, round the end of the hill there, round the back of it, through another tunnel round there, and then come round on the what would be the south side of the flooded valley.
That added a good few chain of...
and then across the dam. And personally I never understood how it managed to get from the dam up onto the level of where the old railway was. If you think back to when we were at Garner Tunnel last year, wasn't it? The difference in size.
It's phenomenal.
Because Garner Tunnel we actually had to make bigger to get the train through it, until it just fits by about an inch. The whole of this 2.5 miles of new line is built to the new line gauge, which is basically you can open the doors of the train and get out of it in emergency.
It is considerably bigger.
I mean, this thing, you see, there's a good walkway right through it. In fact, the rule book says you are prohibited from being in Rhwng Bridge and Garner Tunnel when the trains go through, but you're allowed to be in this one if you think you can breathe, because it fills up with smoke. And on the sort of damp days when the cloud's down low, it stays. If you're in the middle of it, the train goes through and the smoke's following it, and then after a minute the smoke stops. And then you think, well, is it going to go back the other way? But it doesn't move. So now you're trying to think, which way is out. So it's not really advisable. But sometimes it's essential. You see in these concrete portals, there's one at each end, and you see these marks on the side.
The scratch marks.
Now some of those were made by the initial gauging wagon. There was it's like a frame, like a profile of a carriage, and fingers sticking out. You could pull them out on slots, to various measurements. And when they were pulled right out, they were at new line gauge, and these things, they built them about 1/4 inch too small. And you think, well, bearing in mind that each end of this 2.5 miles is the tightest bits on the whole railway, then 1/4 inch wasn't worth worrying about really. But if we'd had an inspecting officer from the railway inspectorate who was a bit pedantic, he'd have probably said, sorry, I'll take it all down and start again. But fortunately the one we had was a very good practical man, and he knew all about the nonsense of making this bigger because the train had to come through the tight bits and whatnot. And as we went through the thing, gauging it for his inspection, and his fingers were getting really close at the sides, the open rock bore had been shotcreted, sprayed concrete instead of brick lining or whatever, and then too much of it had been put on, so we'd had to go through with Kangos and chisel it off to make the gauge go through. And we were somewhere in the middle of it, and there was a big bogie wagon, and there was probably 4 or 5 of us in it, and as it was going along, the fingers were going like that, and they were almost touching the thing, and a bit further up here, on this side, and about halfway through, the inspection officer said to us, that was close, wasn't it, guys? If you'd all stood on this side of the wagon, it would have hit it, wouldn't it? So he tumbled us, because the thing rocked on its central bearing, you see, and they was meant to have screws put in and wound up to take that wobble out of it, but we knew if we did that, it would scrape all along it, so it's cheating really, isn't it? But he let us get away with it, because he was a good guy. 1,000 rock bolts put into this thing, and here and there you can see, I'm sure that might be one up there, they're all encrusted with the concrete spray and everything, but they're bolts, some of them go several metres into the rock, and in a pattern, and then the concrete was sprayed round it. And
is it like there's these 2 bits that are sticking out?
Yeah, but we were bedevilled a bit with experts around this, and one expert would say do this and another one would say do that, and one of the ones that caused a lot of problems was the thinking that you had to put a mesh on the wall and then spray onto and through it. And when they were spraying it, because you used to come in here sometimes and watch, it was pretty horrible, but it was fascinating. And the concrete would stick on the mesh and then start kind of almost cutting itself and sliding down it and fall on the floor. So then somebody else says, oh, you don't need all that mesh in there. So take it all out again. And the concrete mix, it was a pretty high-tech concrete to start with, and it initially had some sort of retarder put in it so that it wouldn't start going off and it could be pumped through the system to the nozzle. And then where it came out the nozzle, another chemical, can't think what it was called now, accelerator, that's obvious really, isn't it, that started the process as soon as it came out the nozzle. The idea being as soon as it hit the wall it would stick. And different ones would come, different chemicals, different mixes, and sometimes it would stick, sometimes it didn't. And of course everything that didn't stick just fell on the floor. And after all the months that they were doing this for, and so much of it had come down and it had come around, and it pretty well got like a tube tunnel, like on the underground. You know? And so we were faced with making a footpath on that side and cess drain on this side by breaking out 268 metres of concrete.
That was fun.
We ruined God knows how many Kango hammers.
I'm not surprised.
And jackhammers battering away in here for ages. And it was not the most pleasant place to work. I managed to avoid most of it because I was a manager, you see.
I've got a meeting to go to.
I could go and sit in my office.
I've got paperwork to do. Fine.
But JGF it wasn't, I'm afraid.
It wasn't.
Pretty well everything else was, but one of the gauge wagons that we had, old Andy up at Blaina, which was my civil depot up there, and he made this on a slate wagon, and he'd cut out the letters JGF and welded them onto it. And the 4 little simplexes that we had on this job for moving all the trains around, they were JGF1, JGF2 and so on. What else can you say about a tunnel? Now this area here, Tunnel South, because it's roughly the south end of the tunnel, hence the name. This became the kind of construction camp for the tunnel, for the cutting and the tunnel, and it spread out. Initially it was just a sort of embankment across, and then it got wider and wider and wider. And as they started digging the cutting, they tipped more and more, because this was a huge big hollow. Yeah. And then workshops and various buildings came. They got a stone crusher, all sorts of machinery, and tracks started building up. And there was everything that came out of the tunnel in skips. There was a track went round here. It's difficult to work out where roughly round there at a higher level, so it could tip into the screen and on into the crusher, and then screens and everything. And there was 3 or 4 tracks here, because the arisings from it went in nominally oversized stuff, or ballast as they called it, which well, we could argue about that. We had to survive for 2 years with no new ballast, because we were getting it free from here. Except it was all irregular lumps, and but it saved us 2 years budget, you see. And we're still paying for it. And then there was the fines that came out of it as well, and they went into another load. And this vast area then became known by somebody as the football pitch.
I take it football was never played?
Probably not.
Okay. So this is obviously a monument, a sort of memorial to Norman Gurley.
Essentially, he came here in 1963, I think. Got a full-time job here. Previously, he'd been the organiser of the London group working parties when I first started coming up here. And then he got a full-time job, and he was working on the track in the winter, and on the trains in the summer as a guard largely, or signalman sometimes. And then as things developed and the line got opened up to the Ast, and permanent tracks started getting laid on the deviation as it was built, then he became largely full-time involved with laying the deviation track. So he was associated with this bit of line quite a lot, and because of the football pitch and everything that happened up here, and so he was involved at this end with like the ballast trains going that way for the relaying jobs and everything. So it seemed appropriate when he died, 2004. He actually emigrated to Australia by then. I think he had a sister there. And it seemed an appropriate spot, because he'd spent so much time working up here, to sprinkle his ashes here, and because this is where he worked and that's where he lived. Other than that, it's a pretty drafty place.
So I'm guessing that was the old railway line.
You guessed correct. It's quite an amazing looking structure, actually, isn't it? It's good actually to look at it from up here, because a large part of the Ffestiniog line, that's quite characteristic of a lot of it. But because when you're on it, you can't see it, can you? And there's a lot of embankments like Bryn Mawr and Crea Bank at Tanabulk and whatnot, where the side of the train is almost flush with the edge of the embankment, and there's no way you can travel on the train and see what it's made of. So this is a good opportunity to actually see a typical, not quite typical, because those rocks are not like a lot of it's made of the much more sort of long thin bits, you know, but this is a particularly good looking one, I think. That there is just the beginning of the cutting, where the old tunnel went in, and you used to be able to see up on the top, but it's all overgrown now, where one of the air vents was. And it actually stood well out the ground. Tunnel mess was just down there where that excavating's been.
Yeah.
This great big building was there where they went for their dirty weekends.
Right.
I think I must emphasise that the story of the deviation construction of the route is a big tale in itself. It was here in 1960 something or other that I first saw Nyrin Davis. Nyrin Davis, the very bad in those days. And I'd heard all sorts of things about him. The circumstances of it were all, there's so many things in this part of the world tied up with the deviation, although this was before the deviation had even started. There was a great land tribunal legal case over compensation for the flooded railway.
Right, okay.
And every now and then they had to bring official people up to have a look, and they had to come up on the train, of course.
Yeah.
And so they had to go right up the old track up to the tunnel, which they couldn't get through now because it was flooded. And we used to get sent up here, this is when I worked with Will Jones, to check the track and bang a few keys in, pull the gauge in a little bit, clear rubbish and stuff off it, so that this train had a fair chance of getting up there and back without falling off. And we were sitting on the old Wickham petrol trolley just down here having our lunch, and across down the slope came this wiry little man with his patches on his elbows, like typical thing, and this great pack of wolfhounds or whatever they were behind him, all with their jaw hanging open and saliva running out, like they hadn't had their dinner. And I thought, oh, that must be Davis the bad, the very bad. And of course he saw Will Jones, and he came down and he chatted with Will, and these dogs all hung around, sort of going around with, dribbling everywhere, and they kept looking at me. And Nyrin didn't even look at me, because he probably already assumed, oh, he's one of these volunteers from London or something, you know. And he chatted with Will for ages, and I thought, why doesn't he go away, take these dogs with him? You know? And eventually off he went. Will was grinning. I says, is that Nyrin Davis? And he said, oh yes, very nice man.
So you keep talking about this lake, although it does look a little bit more like a bog than a lake itself.
Yeah, Ross Lynn. Well, if you look in books with early photographs, you know, back in the old company's days when there was very few trees around, and you could actually see the views, and you'll find this whole space here was almost occupied by the lake, and it went right up to the back of the house. And virtually to the bottom of the embankment that the railway's on across there. And it's kind of, I don't know what you call it, there's a term for it, isn't there, I'm sure. It's like it's grown across and it must be floating on it.
Pondweed.
Well,
almost.
Maybe. But gradually, I suppose it pretends it's land, doesn't it? And if you went for a walk on it, you might go through it. Now, Will Jones used to tell me that in years gone by, somebody had gone out in a little boat and plumbed it.
Right.
And said it was bottomless, probably because his string wasn't long enough. And so we always referred to this as a bottomless lake. So we'd better come back to talking about the track, because that was my job for years, isn't it? And it says I'm the permanent wayman, so I suppose that's what I ought to talk about. And this end of the deviation, as we said earlier, was largely done by hacking in the cuttings, wheeling it in little skips to the end and tipping it until they met.
Yeah.
And so they didn't get an awful lot of, they didn't get compaction like if you're doing it on a road kind of seam, you'd put it in layers and vibrate or roll it or ram it or whatever. It didn't happen here. So it relied on the trains to do it once the traffic started, and you got a lot of settlement in some places and not others.
Yeah.
And it caused us a lot of problems. And this area here was probably amongst the most problematical because the whole thing's on a sharp curve.
Yes.
But this one had a different sort of problem in that it had virtually no transition from the curve to the straight. Certainly not anything enough to get the cant required for 20 mile an hour around it. And if you look up there, you can see the curve gets very close to the hill and it seems to overshoot a bit. This was an attempt to get a better transition into it, because essentially, if you think of Hornby-Dublo track, you get straights and you get curved, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, you can't go straight into the curve with a build-up of cant or not without getting a horrible shock in the train and excessive wear and everything. And so the way to get a transition is either to move the straight or the curve, one relative to the other. And you see the problem here, if we move the curve it falls over the edge, and if we move the straight it climbs into the hill. And we did move the straight, it's well off the centre line up there, and that causes a lot of problems because of the precipitation of stuff from, because all this along here, the hillside was cut back to make the ledge with explosive. And the nature of the rock along here is pretty brittle, and of course it trickled for years and it was piling up all along the bottom. The deviation is like explosives, but I remember when we were talking about Garner Tunnel last year, and wind from the mine used black powder, which is a much more gentle explosive, because if you look at a lot of the cuttings down on the old railway, shall we call it, and they drilled the holes and then blown it with black powder, split it off, and you can still see the half on the rock that's good and solid. But this was a bit heavier, shall we say. And for quite a few years the stuff was trickling down, piling up in the cess until the bottom of the train started scraping it. And then we'd take it away, train loads of it, shovel it into trains, take it down to Minford, and where the spread of sidings is at Minford, at the top yard, which used to be just alongside, and then the second one, the third one and the fourth one, this is where most of it came from.
Oh, right, okay, well, there you go.
So, you know, it's bad in one way, but good in another. But the problems of trying to maintain all this lot for 20 mile an hour were just consuming so much of our fairly meagre maintenance resource. Per mile it was taking about roughly 3 miles worth of our effort. So we dropped it to 15 mile an hour, which needs considerably less cant and a shorter transition. And there's I'm not quite sure of the validity of this, but we tried continuing the curve a little further so that the transition ran further out there and then kick it back again. And hope the train didn't notice. It seems to work. But another thing we found with this, unlike the Ffestiniog, the original Ffestiniog Railway, which was built for loaded slate trains to run by gravity down, every curve they come to is extra resistance, so the gradient was made steeper. So compensation in the gradient was the opposite to what we want today when we're hauling great heavy loads up the hill. And so that's, in a sense, most of that is still there because you can't alter it hugely. And so whenever they come to a sharp curve, the gradient gets steeper. So the whole of the deviation was set out compensation in favour of the uphill train. I can't remember offhand what the gradients are, there's bits of 1 in 80 on the straights, and I think we saw 120.
120, yeah.
Gradient sign up there, didn't he? Talking on the compensation of the gradient for the curve, and so what we've got here is a sharp curve, therefore the gradient is considerably flatter, and some of the train crews had a bit of problem getting used to it, and this was the classic one because they come batting down there, and then you see this very sharp curve ahead and brake hard, too much, too slow, and roll into a very sharp curve with high drag with a flatter gradient, and wonder why the train nearly stopped. And if we were around here somewhere, you'd hear them coming down there, and you'd hear that, and then it chuff 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 chuff. And really, it's like everything, it comes with experience, doesn't it? But it's, you know, this bit of railway is different from the rest of it in a number of respects, and that was one that probably most people wouldn't be aware of. Now, a good point to end up is the end of the line. The buffer, well, it was the end of the line for one train. When it was a token point and trains were passing here, and there was a down train here, and there was some confusion, shall we say, between the signalman and the engine driver, I think, and the delay and the inevitable things. If something doesn't happen as you expect it to happen, then maybe you don't check this, that and the other. Whatever happened, the train set off, opened the rail regulator, chuff, 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 and the points had been put back again because I think the signalman thought it had gone, and it went up there, as if it was going to Portmadoc. And then this track was shorter, and it didn't curve round there.
Right, okay.
So it was more like an extended track point. Well, it did its job, because on the end of that siding was a massive rail-built buffer that came from Drayton Park in London, when we bought a load of rail from there. And we'd assembled it on there. Massive, great thing. So the engine hit it, the tender tried to climb over it, but it also broke a fish plate just behind the first bogie of the coach, I think it was, and pushed the buffer and the track along. So that when it had stopped, there was about a 6-foot gap in the rails, in the middle of the carriage. And surprisingly, very, very little. And it stopped just short of fouling the other line, which a track point's meant to do. So really, it was a happy tale because everything did what it was meant to do, except the train.
Other than the train.
And we came up here, it was raining, and I got a mate who worked on the railway down in Kent who was up here, and he come up here because I was going to show him all sorts of things around here, you know, how we did it well. And so I got called out in the evening, so he came with me. We came up here, the Boston Lodge came up with all the re-railing stuff and everything. Finally got it all back on the rails at something like 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was raining. We got electric lamps, 240 volt with a generator, and we kept singing. It was quite an exciting night, really. And finally, when we got everything back on, because we'd had to put a bit of rail in the gap to get the train back off it and everything, and we had it all hooked together with the train, the engine, which was okay to run. You know, it hadn't bent itself much. And the Boston Lodge wrecking train, and I think I brought my train up as well, with Ina. And finally we all went sailing back down in the dark and the rain. And because it was early hours of the morning, so we'd been ever so quiet going through Penryn, you know. And when we stopped at the top end of Minford, my bit of the train, I wanted to go down the yard, and the rest of it was going to Boston Lodge. So we stopped, unhooked, drove my bit in, set the points back, waved to the Boston Lodge guy to carry on, and he went, oh! And that's probably a good place to stop.